Hello, and welcome to the second session of the Warnell Rangers Institute. This time our topic is poverty in the 19th century, specifically about workhouses. You'll hear more in other videos about how the Majors family connects to workhouses and Kansas City as well. But today I'm going to be focusing on women and poverty, and we'll touch a bit on Kansas City women and poverty towards the end. So as far as women in poverty go, there's quite a bit of ground to cover here. So I wanted to walk you through what we're talking about. First, we'll cover ideal womanhood and how it could be accessed by different classes of women. We'll also talk about how urban and rural women experience poverty differently. And finally, we'll cover what female poverty looked like in Kansas City. So ideal womanhood, I've mentioned this a couple times so far and haven't said anything about it, but ideal womanhood was this idea in the late 18th century going into the 19th century, which was espoused by middle-class and elite women. Their idea of the Republican motherhood and of the domestic sphere being kind of their area in which they could operate and in which they should operate was something which became more regimented as a concept and as a reality for a lot of middle-class and elite women in the 19th century. This was something that they saw as allowing them some agency by making them responsible for raising citizens properly. This was something called moral or Republican motherhood, which you can see on the screen. They also saw themselves as responsible for directing civil morals and also the education of their children. This was kind of what middle class and elite women saw as their method of shaping society, although it was practiced from home. Now, the domestic sphere and ideal womanhood was, of course, an idea. It was not necessarily a reality for all women in the middle class or even in the elite spheres, and it was certainly not a reality for poorer women or working class women. However, it was a very strong idea, and it was something that was debated a lot in the press and in people's letters and writing, and also just daily conversations. Even as late as the 20s and the 30s in the 20th century, people believed that women were built for motherhood and that was their general purpose in life. The Kansas City Star, for example, reported in 1929 on October the 3rd that a woman has less muscularity than men, but being designed for motherhood, she has more vitality. You can see that here. Now, the notion of domesticity, like I said, was becoming more entrenched in society in the 19th century, but it was also expanding. Women such as Jane Addams, who is pictured here, took their middle-class stature and used it to expand their domestic sphere out into society. They saw themselves as being morally and financially responsible for poorer women. Now, this was not necessarily something that poor women asked for. It was something that some of them did benefit from, of course, when they were given money. But what middle-class and even elite women would sometimes do is enter into poor neighborhoods and kind of attempt to socially control poor women in the way that they saw themselves as being able to socially control their own children and their own families. One of the reasons for this is that working class women were more susceptible to poverty and were also generally unable to access this ideal of the domestic sphere and of ideal womanhood. I'll talk a bit more about that later, but I just wanted to point out that the expansion of domesticity was also something happening, and that middle class women, particularly activists like Jane Addams, were kind of pushing. They were treating this notion of the domestic sphere as their form of agency, of something that they could take control of and be in charge of. Now, for working class women, the 19th century didn't look a whole lot different, other than that people were starting to industrialize and women were starting to enter the workforce in higher numbers and greater volume. The Industrial Revolution and also urbanization, which are two processes that were going on quite a bit during the 19th century, contributed to furthering the gap between middle and working class women, as well as middle and working class men. But women are our topic here today, because waged labor, it removed women from their homes. So it made that ideal of the domestic sphere even harder for working class women to access, because they were being removed from their homes by going to factories or other forms of work. One of these factories is pictured here in the middle. Like I said, though, working class women were also more susceptible to poverty, even though they were earning money, because they were receiving very low wages relative to working class men. And they also often had to work for piece rates rather than wages. Piece rates would be something like if they received money for each shirt that they sewed or pants or something like that. Within the working class as well, there were multiple levels of poverty. Some wage earners were more well off due to earning a more regular wage. A lot of industries, such as the textile industry, was quite seasonal. Clothing was made on a very seasonal basis, so women would either earn no piece rates or fewer piece rates for the off seasons, or they would simply be fired for those seasons and be unemployed. Now, this industry and other industries were also subject to quite a bit of wage fluctuation due to supply and demand. But women were also subject to something called invisible poverty, because people like women in the middle classes and upper classes believed that women should not be working. When women were unemployed in the working classes, they were not really perceived as being unemployed. They were just seen as staying at home and fulfilling the women's proper place, right? So women who were unemployed or who were working from home could have been seen as either not being unemployed, in fact, or being invisibly poor, which could affect their ability to make claims for things like social aid from these middle class women. However, even when women were experiencing things like invisible poverty and invisible unemployment, they and their children could still make money in certain ways. Children are often involved in mothers who were working from home in a form of work called outwork, where they would just work and do all their sewing at home. They could also contribute to family economies through scavenging, hawking goods. Newspapers particularly were a good task for children to earn money and contribute to a family income. However, poverty also looked very different for working class women on the rural front. So far, we've been talking all about urban women, people living in cities and or around cities, like in factories or maybe more suburban. But in rural areas, poverty could also look quite different, and it was still sometimes invisible. Rural women, despite having maybe more property than urban women, so perhaps looking more wealthy, they still were unable to really access that domestic sphere because their work took them away from home as well. They had to work in fields, perhaps supporting the rest of their family with farm work and such. However, rural women, because they were property owners and because they had more say, I suppose, in their homes, they were able to mimic middle-class women's domesticity by doing domestic production, like making rugs, curtains, fancy work, things like this, although their work was generally more functional than decorative. And finally, we'll move on to Kansas City, which I know is the more exciting part because it's more anecdotal. However, like we've been talking mostly about urban poverty and a little bit about rural poverty. Kansas City was a little bit of a mix between those two because it was an urban center, but also in the West, so it was further removed from the larger cities like New York and Chicago. The Midwest in the 19th century saw a huge influx of immigrant labor and as well as Black labor from the South to their new industries of shipping, packing, slaughterhouses, railroads, things like this. And that huge influx of immigration and of new industries contributed to different types of female poverty in this region, as well as others. Kansas City was not unique in this respect. In Kansas City, Missouri, this looked a lot like slum buildup, and eventually in the 20th century, those slums would later be removed to beautify the city according to middle class and elite standards. But during the 19th century, Kansas City's slums and their new forms and new volumes of female and just general working class poverty resulted in in things like the workhouse, the municipal rock quarry, and municipal farm, all of which were essentially poor houses, although they had different functions and people were employed differently at them. Female inmates sewed uniforms generally at the workhouse, whereas male inmates would perform hard labor like rock carrying. But female inmates were interned alongside male inmates. Similarly, Black inmates were interned alongside white inmates. There have been previous workhouses in Kansas City. The one that you can see an article about here is the one from 1897. However, there had been workhouses in Kansas City as early as 1866. For example, in 1877, the Kansas City workhouse listed a population of 30 men and 5 women. So you can see there's a gender disparity, but women and men are still alongside each other. This workhouse was integrated. There was a story there about a Black man named Lou Davis, who had been about to be released, but earned another term for disorderly conduct. He was later escaped and was found with another inmate after 2 months from escaping. So you can see people who were in the poorhouse sometimes came back and came back and came back, and their stories were printed in the paper because they were a source of interest and fascination for the middle class people who saw themselves as being more respectable. People were sent to the workhouse not just for poverty or for debt, but also for things like Lou Davis, like disorderly conduct, petty crimes like prostitution and trespassing, and other things. A lot of these crimes are, of course, things that were more frequently engaged in by people who were of the working classes and who needed money. But the workhouse and the municipal rock quarry and the municipal farm were not just places to send debtors. They were also for petty crimes like those. A few instances of people being sent to the workhouse. For example, in 1878, the police raided a place called Hell's Half Acre Ranch, which was owned by a woman named Bow-Legged Liz, and they arrested a whole crowd for the workhouse. In 1892, snake-fingered tip Lizzie Parks, a Black woman, was fined $10 and then later sent to the workhouse for pickpocketing and disorderly conduct. So you can see those petty crimes as well. In Kansas City, the workhouse, the municipal rock quarry, and the municipal farm were an example of the reformist attitude that was emerging in Kansas City at the end of the 19th century. This reformist attitude was generally perpetrated by the middle class people, and it did other things as well, such as the parks and recreation system was part of this reformist attitude, but so was controlling the poor. This is part of that expansion of the domestic sphere that middle class women like Jane Addams were doing. We talked about that a bit earlier. Because middle class and elite people in Kansas City and in other cities saw it as their role and their essentially their job to control and to help poor people find methods for self-help. Now, this independence that middle class people had kind of contradicted the reality of urban poor lives, like those in Kansas City, because they had to deal with the realities of living in a city, in a very crowded and a very poor city, with overcrowding, communal living, things like this. All of those factors of living in slums and in tenements helped to continue people's poverty cycles. It also affected people's access to education. This is something that we can continue to see modeled in our current society. But the reform efforts, such as those targeted at the workhouse, rock quarry, and farm, did lead to some subsequent changes in worker protections for people across the country, such as the new 8-hour workday, workers' compensation, child labor laws. All of these things did help with poverty, but they still continue to not quite address the root issues. And that's an issue we continue to see modeled today. But thank you all for coming to this second session of the Mortal Majors Institute. I hope you learned something, that you enjoy the other videos, and we'll see you next month for session 3. Bye.